Somewhere in a swamp in southern Mexico, there's a stone face the size of a delivery truck, and for over a century, almost nobody wanted to admit who actually carved it. Not because the answer was hidden, because the answer was uncomfortable. 17 of these faces have been pulled out of the mud so far, some of them weighing more than a loaded school bus, each one carved from a single uncut block of volcanic rock, each one a completely different human being frozen mid-thought 3,000 years ago. And for 200 years, the people studying them kept arriving at the same strange, wrong conclusion, over and over, no matter how much new evidence piled up. Feed everything we now know into a model built to strip away assumption, and just show you the pattern in the data, and the picture that comes back is almost embarrassing in its simplicity. Not because it's exotic, because it's obvious, and we spent 2 centuries refusing to see it. Let's go back to where these things came from, because the origin story matters more than the mystery itself. Around 1500 BC, on the humid Gulf Coast of what is now the Mexican state of Veracruz, a civilization started forming out of slow rivers, thick rainforests, and floodplain soil rich enough to support real population growth. We don't know what these people called themselves. The name history uses for them, Olmec, actually comes from a completely different, much later people who live in the same region and simply inherited an old word for rubber people, a reference to the rubber trees that grew there. By the time anyone wrote that label down, the ones who built these cities and carved these faces had already been gone for over 1,000 years, already reduced to rumor and ruin. But what they built while they were here was staggering. San Lorenzo rose first, a real planned urban center with drainage systems and ceremonial platforms, flourishing from around 1200 BC. Later came La Venta with its earthen pyramid rising out of the jungle floor, and eventually Tres Zapotes carried the tradition forward after the earlier centers declined. These weren't loose collections of huts. These were capitals, seats of political and religious authority commanding labor, trade, and territory. And then, around 400 BC, it all came apart. Nobody knows the full reason. Shifting river courses, environmental pressure, internal conflict, probably some combination of all three. The centers emptied out, the jungle reclaimed the plazas, and the carved stone faces sank slowly into the earth where they'd stand undisturbed for over 2,000 years. Here's the part that gets skipped in most tellings. This culture didn't just disappear. It became the root system for almost everything that followed in Mesoamerica. The calendar of the Maya are famous for tracing eclipses and cycles with astonishing precision. Its foundational structure traces back to this Gulf Coast culture. The layered cosmology the Aztecs built their entire religious world around, the recurring gods, the sacred symbols, much of that vocabulary originated here first and simply got passed down, generation after generation, civilization after civilization, the way a language gets inherited without anyone remembering who spoke the first sentence. And then there's the writing. In 1999, near the old Olmec heartland, archaeologists found a carved stone slab covered in rows of small, repeating symbols, arranged in patterns that look deliberately linguistic rather than decorative. It's called the Cascadule block, and it's been dated to roughly 900 BC. Many specialists who studied it believe this makes it the earliest known system of writing anywhere in the Americas, though it remains a genuinely debated question since only this one example has ever surfaced. If that reading holds, it means this civilization invented writing entirely on its own, with zero outside contact, joining an extremely short list of cultures in all of human history that ever pulled off that feat independently, alongside ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia, and ancient China. This is a civilization we're actually talking about. Not a curiosity, not a footnote, a root civilization that an entire hemisphere grew out of. And the object that carried its name into the modern world, the ones tourists travel to see and museums build entire wings around, are those 17 colossal heads. Stand in front of one and let the scale actually register. The smallest confirmed head stands around 6 feet tall, already taller than most adults. The largest reaches roughly 11 feet, about the height of a basketball hoop, and is estimated to weigh somewhere in the range of 40 tons. Every single one was carved from one continuous, uncut block of basalt, a dense, dark volcanic stone. No seams, no smaller pieces joined together. One stone, one face. And every block came from the same source, the Tuxtla Mountains, a volcanic range sitting roughly 60 miles inland from where most of the heads were ultimately found. 60 miles of dense rainforest, river crossings, and swampland that turns to knee-deep mud in the rainy season, with a block of stone that can weigh as much as 50 tons. And here's a detail that should genuinely stop you. This civilization had no wheels, no horses, no oxen, no domesticated pack animals of any kind, because none existed anywhere in the Americas at that point in history. No iron, no bronze, no metal tools whatsoever. Every part of this, quarrying the stone, moving it across 60 miles of hostile terrain, and then carving individual, expressive human features into it, was done using stone tools, human muscle, and a level of organizational coordination we're only now starting to properly respect. And then there are the faces themselves, which is really where this whole story lives. From the moment the first of these heads was uncovered, it was obvious this wasn't some repeated symbolic mask stamped out from a single mold. Each face is completely distinct. Line two of them up next to each other, and you will not confuse one for the other. The brow line changes. The width of the nose changes. The fullness of the lips, the angle of the jaw, the particular set of the mouth, all of it shifts from head to head. One face looks weathered and stern, like someone who's carried authority for decades. Another looks younger, rounder, softer around the eyes. These aren't stylized types repeated for effect. These are individuals. Specific, once-living human beings whose likenesses someone chose to lock into 50 tons of volcanic rock, so they would never be forgotten. And that's exactly what makes them so easy to misread if you're not paying attention, because a portrait carved at this scale is a statement. It says this person mattered enough to justify years of labor, enough to justify hauling stone through swamp and forest, enough to justify the patient work of shaping a human face out of solid rock using nothing but harder stone. Nobody does that for an abstract idea. You do that for a specific person whose authority shaped the lives of everyone around them. For almost 200 years, though, that fairly straightforward truth, that these are portraits of real individual rulers, got buried under a completely different story, one that had almost nothing to do with the people who actually built this civilization. It started in 1862, and it started, as these things often do, almost by accident. A farm worker clearing land near the town of Huyapan in Veracruz hit something solid under the soil. He assumed it was the base of a massive overturned pot. He kept digging. What came out of the ground instead was a face. A colossal human face, eyes half-lidded, lips full, wrapped in a helmet-like headdress. It was the first of these great stone heads to reach the outside world. Word reached an antiquarian named Jose Maria Melgo y Serrano, a man educated entirely within the European intellectual tradition of his time. He came to examine the head, and when he looked at that ancient carved face, he didn't describe what was actually in front of him. He described what his training had conditioned him to expect. He declared the features Ethiopian, African in origin. He looked at a sculpture made by the founding civilization of an entire hemisphere and concluded it simply could not have been made by the ancestors of the indigenous people living in that exact region. Sit with the logic underneath that claim for a second, because the logic is the entire story. Melgo y Serrano had no artifact pointing to contact across an ocean, no linguistic evidence, no trade goods, nothing. What he had was an assumption buried so deep he didn't experience it as an assumption. The colonial era conviction that indigenous peoples of the Americas simply weren't capable of producing monumental art at this level of sophistication on their own, and that something this accomplished had to have originated somewhere else entirely. And a claim like that doesn't need evidence to survive. It just needs to be useful to somebody. This idea, that the heads depicted people of African descent and that some ancient transoceanic contact had shaped Olmec civilization, should have quietly died the moment real archaeological methods arrived. Instead, it kept getting passed along, book after book, decade after decade, surviving the rise of professional archaeology, surviving the maturing of anthropology as a discipline, surviving even the arrival of genetic and isotopic science that could actually test the claim directly. It survived all of it, not because the evidence supported it, but because different people, for very different reasons, found it useful to keep repeating. Real pushback against it didn't come from an argument. It came from digging. In the 1930s, an archaeologist named Matthew Sterling led expeditions on behalf of major American scientific institutions to the Gulf Coast to do something almost nobody had seriously attempted: study this culture as an actual dated civilization instead of treating it as an unsolved riddle to argue about from a distance. His teams excavated the major centers, uncovered more heads, more altars, more carved jade, and critically, build a real chronology layer by careful layer, establishing just how old this culture actually was. The dates that came back reordered the entire timeline of Mesoamerican history. This culture wasn't late. It wasn't a downstream copy of some older tradition. It sat at the very base of everything, earlier than the Maya, earlier than anyone had assumed possible. This wasn't a civilization that had received its sophistication from somewhere else. This was the civilization everyone else had inherited from. And in all of that careful, methodical work, something is conspicuously missing. Sterling's team, and every serious archaeologist who followed him into the region afterward, never found a shred of evidence supporting the idea of African origin. Not because they weren't looking, because they looked honestly, and it simply wasn't there. What the excavations revealed instead was a culture that explained itself completely on its own terms. Look at the 17 confirmed heads across the 4 known sites, and you don't see 17 copies of a single template. You see 17 individuals, each with real facial asymmetries, real irregularities, the kind of subtle imperfection that belongs to an actual living face and not a stylized formula repeated by rote. These read as portraits. And once you accept that they are portraits, the entire framing of the mystery shifts. The question stops being why do these faces look unfamiliar, and becomes who are these specific men, powerful enough that their people moved a literal mountain of stone to preserve their likeness. Because that's what a monument on this scale means. You don't haul 50 tons of rock across 60 miles of swamp to honor a stranger. You do it to honor a ruler. This is also where more recent scientific tools start converging with that older excavation work. When you look honestly at the facial features on these heads, broad noses, full lips, distinct individual proportions, they fall entirely within the natural range of indigenous Mesoamerican variation. The old racial framework that tried to sort human faces into neat, separate categories was never built on how faces actually work. Human facial features vary continuously across every population on Earth. Broad noses and full lips occur naturally and consistently among indigenous peoples of the Americas and always have. That point connects directly to what population genetics has revealed about the peopling of the Americas. Indigenous populations across the continent descend from groups who migrated from Asia via the Bering land bridge many thousands of years before Olmec civilization even existed, a migration that's now traceable through extensive genetic sequencing across both ancient and modern indigenous populations. Across that substantial body of genetic research, no pre-Columbian African genetic signature has been identified in indigenous American DNA. If there had been meaningful transatlantic contact and intermixing during the Olmec period, you would expect that to leave some kind of detectable trace. It hasn't, because there's no genetic evidence that it happened. Alongside the genetics, archaeological science has looked at the skeletal record from Olmec sites and consistently placed the individual studied within the local population, rather than pointing toward outside origins. Taken together, the archaeological chronology, the stylistic analysis of the art itself, and the population genetics all converge on the same conclusion, arrived at independently through completely different methods. That's what a genuinely solid conclusion looks like. Not one claim repeated loudly for 2 centuries, but multiple separate fields of study landing at the same answer on their own. And yet the African origin idea didn't just quietly disappear once professional archaeology settled the chronology. It went dormant in mainstream scholarship, but it didn't die. In the mid-1970s it resurfaced, this time carrying a very different motivation. The writer Ivan van Sertima published a book arguing that Africans had reached and influenced the Americas before European contact, and he pointed to the Olmec heads as his central piece of evidence. This time the claim wasn't rooted in colonial contempt. For many who embraced it, it functioned as an act of reclamation, a counter-narrative pushing back against centuries of history that had systematically erased African achievement and contribution. That motivation came from a real and understandable grievance.